Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is, I think, our two, three, four, five, maybe sixth installment of the Suicide Justice Salon series, where we are inviting scholars from many different disciplines, many different backgrounds, many different contexts around the world to join us at the Critical Health and Social Action Lab in a conversation around suicide justice, a term that comes to us from the work of Kristen Cardon's work on suicide justice, where she invites us into an analytic lens to really begin thinking critically about suicide alongside other struggles and organizing for racial, economic, gender, sexual, environmental, and justice otherwise. To think critically about the ways that premature death by suicide is situated within ecological contexts of political debate, are situated in um, political struggles, and most significantly in the context that both myself and Dr. Gray work within, settler colonial ones. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to welcome you all to this conversation today. For those of you joining us live and those of you who will access this recording later online. We've had a really, important series so far this year, which has helped us to think and really center the work of ethics, applied ethics, and what different epistemological starting points offer us to conversations about ethics and suicide, to think very deeply about creating material conditions for livability, um, under the shadow of empire, under the occupation of indigenous peoples' lands, and in reckoning with the violence of carceral um, securitizing and policing systems and structures. And so I'm really delighted today to welcome Dr. Mandi Gray. Among many things, Mandi is a comrade, and I know this because of my relationships with so many people for whose lives have been made more just by the presence of Mandi in them. And so I'm really delighted to welcome a comrade to this conversation first and foremost. But among the many accolades I could tell you about Dr. Gray, I will share that Mandi is an assistant professor at Trent University in the Department of Criminology, though trained as a sociologist. And not an uncommon move, actually, these days in Canadian universities. But among Mandy's many and multifaceted research interests, which include research that interrogates the intersections of structural violence and resistance among a number of communities, looks very specifically at sociolegal processes like inquests and inquiries and institutional and governmental responses to uh, sexual violence, death in custody, and um, Indigenous health, uh, has written a series of articles over the years that have always kind of caught my attention. And partly one of those reasons is because we're both from Winnipeg, and that has some very deep relevance to the scholarship that um, Dr. Gray has done. But more than just being from Winnipeg, I know there's other people on the call here who have spent time living in Winnipeg. Winnipeg is a city of very particular racialized geography. And when I began reading Dr. Gray's work, I could discern politics very immediately from some of the places that your work has taken up. One of the most significant papers um, in the Studies in Social Justice journal that first caught my attention in 2016 was Pathologizing Indigenous Suicide, examining the inquest into the deaths of CJ and CB at the Manitoba Youth Center. As a former resident in the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority, one of my minor rotations that I completed during my training as a psychologist was in the Manitoba Youth Center. And I saw very close hand, and I should say that was my first encounter with the Manitoba Youth Center. As a young person, like I think the first time I went into that place, I was around 7 or 8 years old, and I went with my mom, um, who was volunteering in our community, meeting with Indigenous young people and brought me with her. And so I remember being a really young kid going with my mom into the youth center, traveling through the different layers of security. And I think very early that place politicized me, and is part of the seeds of my thinking, um, and my kind of general perspectives that have evolved over time in relationship to the incommensurability with liberation and carceral systems. And so it's a real delight to welcome you both with some of those personal nodes of connection, but also with a deep appreciation for the criticality of your scholarship. And among other things, I just want to draw attention to Dr. Gray's, I think now award-nominated book, or if not award-winning book, Suing for Silence, Sexual Violence, and oh, I'm forgetting the rest of the title.
Defamation law.
And defamation law. Yes, thank you. Which is an extraordinary work and a labor of deep political commitment and life. And I'm just so grateful to welcome you to this conversation today, Mandy. And I know that what you have to share will be attended to with great attention. And yeah, I really appreciate you, yeah, bringing this piece of work to us today. The title of Dr. Gray's talk today is Unsettling Inquiries into Suicide in Alberta. And with that, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. Thanks for the awesome introduction. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate for all of you for being here on Friday of Reading Week. So it's very nice. And thank you, Deanna, for organizing and sending me lots of follow-ups when I was kind of slow to respond. So I really appreciate all the labor to bring me here today. So I'm going to continue to locate myself. You heard a bit about me, but I'm going to continue to locate myself in this research and how I came to do it. Suicide is really not my primary source of research. Again, it kind of just emerged, and to any graduate students here, write the paper or submit and publish the papers that you write during your graduate studies, because this was just a paper I had written in a biopolitics class in the first year of my PhD. And it's actually been a lot more influential than I could have ever guessed when my prof first encouraged me to publish it. So anyone in the master's or PhD program, definitely get those papers into circulation. And you'll hear more about how the submission of this paper and this paper that I wrote 10 years ago has continued to come back up. But I say that to say I'm not most of my research is in the area of gender-based violence, but I'm so honored to be here and revisit some of the work. And I have been continuing to work in this area, but at a very, very slow pace. So it is really nice to have this invitation and get pushed back into sharing some of the findings of the work that's been sitting in my computer untouched for several years now. So I'm going to begin just a high-level overview. I'm going to give you the background. I'm not going to bore you with the legal details, but what is an inquest? Just so everyone has a working knowledge and understanding of what an inquest can do, what it can't do. I'm going to talk briefly about the paper that Dr. Ansels had mentioned at the Manitoba Youth Center into the deaths of 2 suicides, and this paper was the one I had published and probably had written about 10 years ago now. And then move into the more recent work that I have been doing specific to looking at suicides in Alberta. I have kind of a half-baked conclusion because it's still a work in progress, and I feel like everything that has needed to be said has been said, and it's now time for action. But we'll get to that at the conclusion, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions that folks might have about the research, and I've left some time there. So to get into it, very high level overview of what is an inquest. It's a legal procedure that is used to uncover the factors leading to the death of an individual through expert knowledge and opinions, and anyone else that may have witnessed the death. So it can involve different organizations, advocacy groups, family members that might be called to testify. There are certain circumstances where legislation dictates an inquest must occur. So, for example, if there's a death of a child in the child welfare system or a prisoner. And At the conclusion of the hearing, the judge overseeing the inquest will write a report to present the facts of the case, including how the individual died, the cause of death, the name of the deceased, and the material circumstances of the death. If the judge sees fit, they can make recommendations to prevent deaths of a similar nature. However, it's not required that they make recommendations. It's really important to note that in an inquest, there is no criminal or civil liability. Therefore, there's no legal responsibility or blame assigned to individuals or institutions involved in the death. In fact, there is legislation that if a line of questioning of a witness delves into potential for civil liability or criminal responsibility, the judge can intervene and shut down that line of questioning. So, as I mentioned, because there is no finding of fact in terms of criminal or civil liability, it also allows for a broader scope of evidence to be included into the inquest. It really relies, like I said earlier, really heavily upon the intersection of legal knowledge and medical knowledge, psychiatry, expert discourses of social work, education, and is really constrained by these narrow legal principles. So the parties are acting as witnesses and are typically represented by legal counsel. So this work began for me, or when I became most interested in inquests, was shortly after my undergraduate degree at the University of Winnipeg. I started working for Elizabeth Fry Society of Manitoba in around 2008. And they're a small organization located in the north end of Winnipeg and provide advocacy for women, girls, and gender nonconforming folks who are involved in the criminal legal system. And in Manitoba, that meant a vast majority of my caseload are Indigenous peoples. I think it was about 90%. In 2010, there were two First Nations girls, CJ and CB, both of whom were incarcerated at the Manitoba Youth Center. And both of them had died by suicide, and they were a joint inquest was called because of the similarities in their deaths and that they had occurred approximately 6 months apart from one another. The Elizabeth Fry Society of Manitoba, the organization I worked for, was a party at the inquest to make, recommendations around the understanding of the conditions of imprisonment, specifically for female youth, and to provide suggestions for the prevention of similar deaths in the future. On occasion, relevant organizations, as I mentioned, can be given standing to present a larger picture of some of the circumstances that might help the judge in making the recommendations for prevention. So the inquest findings were released in July of 2012. So I myself did not attend any of the inquest hearings. However, I had spent plenty of time in the Manitoba Youth Center in my role as an advocate. So maybe Jeffrey and I have actually crossed paths before or worked with the same youth. I don't know. I didn't attend any of the inquest hearings, but my colleagues had often talked about how frustrated they were with how the hearing had unfolded. They were unhappy with the structure of the inquest due to the big constraints that were on the types of evidence that could be submitted, the lawyer's hesitancy to use words like colonialism or colonization when making submissions on behalf of the organization, and like really the legal actors' inability to recognize the serious linkages between the suicides of these young First Nations women, incarceration, and colonization. So I moved from Winnipeg to Toronto to do my master's, and I was doing a lot of research in the area of provincial incarceration because there's just not a lot of research especially within the Manitoba context, in comparison to what the research that exists for federally incarcerated people. And this inquest was something that had really stuck with me as I moved into my graduate studies, as something that felt very like unjust to these young women and like the conditions of confinement or imprisonment and how they were talked about in the final report. So this is what led to the paper that was published in the Studies in Social Justice in 2016. And I wrote this, as I mentioned, in the first year of my PhD. And The paper critically examines the inquest into the deaths of CJ and CB, who I had mentioned in the previous slide, and I look at it as at the inquest as a discursive space that relies primarily on expert knowledges of law and psychiatry, and analyze how suicide discourse in the inquest is reduced to manifestations of violence to racial defect, and places the responsibility on these two young women for their suicide and their alleged inability to cope with the conditions of imprisonment. So I built on the work of Ian Marsh and his genealogy of suicide to its most recent conceptualization of mental illness and the growing discipline of critical suicide studies, which aims to critique the over-reliance on the dominant authority of the sciences to explain suicide and expand the scope to interrogate suicide from a social justice perspective that relies on numerous forms and diverse forms of knowledge. So I argue that the contemporary understanding of Indigenous suicide in custody systematically erased the colonial violence and reduced the suicide to an issue of individual pathology that can be identified and treated through medicalization, psychiatrization, and the criminalization. So just a few of my influences for this work. I was very much inspired by Shireen Razik's critical examination of inquests and inquiries into Indigenous deaths in custody, which was very nicely published right before I finished the paper. So it was a very good resource to bolster the arguments that I was making. As I mentioned, Ian Marsh, his seminal work on suicide provided a really fantastic analysis of the social, historical, cultural, and scientific practices that have been used to construct the contemporary understanding of suicide and how it is discursively constructed as pathology. There's also the book Dying to Please You by Roland D. Christen and Shaughnessy McKay, who write from an Indigenous worldview and challenge the notion that this deficit-based understanding of Indigenous suicide and links Indigenous suicide to ongoing colonization, dispossession, and oppression. So these texts were really largely informing my analysis. Of course, the other things informing my analysis were my conversations with my colleagues, spending time. I spent a lot of time in the Manitoba Youth Center, a lot of time in the Women's Correctional Center in Manitoba. So I've spent many, many hours working with women who are imprisoned, which also very much influenced my understanding and then along with these texts. And so there were really few texts at the time, though, that were critically interrogating the role of inquests and inquiries, and specifically within the understanding of how it advances colonial ideas about indigeneity and the erasure of colonialism. And critical suicide studies was like a relatively smaller body of literature 10 years ago. Marsh's book really helped get me through that part, but I had very few texts to rely on in comparison to all the work that's been done in the decades since. Razik's work was really critical for demonstrating the importance of the inquest to assist with advancing the pathologization of Indigenous people. And through her reading of inquests and inquiries into Indigenous deaths in custody, she argues that the inquest is a tool of colonial governance, resulting in further extension of state regulation of Indigenous people because no one is to blame, and then thus no one can be called into account except for themselves, which is a theme you'll see throughout the research. The expert knowledges presented within the inquiry or the inquest are used to validate the claim that Indigenous people are simply hard to care for or even beyond care, and that settler society has simply attempted to save a dying race. Through the inquiry and inquest, a settler society defines itself as benevolent, in which it's so often articulated through the process. And this was very clearly articulated into the inquest into the deaths of CJ and CB at the Manitoba Youth Center. So, for example, the judge frequently constructed CJ and CB as incapable of recognizing the help they were being offered. And the Manitoba Youth Center is presented as a demonstration of modernity that could save these Indigenous youth from their pre-modern practices in their First Nations homes. The MYC staff are praised for their dedicated service to these young women. In fact, the judge declares that the suicides are doubly tragic, in fact, because the staff had worked simply so hard to try and save these disobedient and difficult to care for youth. Um, oh, I'm just going to go back to this slide and then I'll go. So this is actually a quote from one of the psychiatric nurses who testified at the inquest, and it's cited in the paper as well. And this quote really was used by the judge to demonstrate the fact that these young people just need to try harder because the youth center was giving them all the tools that they needed, but they simply could not learn how to better cope with the conditions of imprisonment. And the judge, citing a psychiatric nurse, writes, they've come from such trauma and abuse. And I mean, there's a reason that they get there. They're not just rotten little kids that end up at NYC one day. It's like, they don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. They don't see that if they work harder, that, they might enjoy the fruits of their labor. They just see like it doesn't matter which way I turn, I'm screwed kind of thing. So it's, they learn to sort of, kids learn with what they're given growing up. So it's a sad state, really. Again, advancing that deficit knowledge, that they're not given the proper tools in their home community, and they need to come to NYC and cannot accept the conditions of imprisonment. I also relied on Heidi Rimke's concept of psychocentrism, which diagnoses social problems and human struggles as an innate pathology of the individual, who is held individually responsible for both their health and illness, and then the larger cultural framework in which we are expected to view the human existence through the lens of a psi complex, rather than looking for alternative frameworks for understanding and acting that might exist outside of the psi sciences, again, referring specifically to psychology and psychiatry. So ultimately in the paper, I make three arguments. The first is that the inquest is a legal tool that is used to legitimize settler colonialism and anti-Indigenous racism. The second is that official discourses, including expert testimony, failed to address social and structural consequences of colonialism, instead prioritizing the side discourses to explain the suicides of the young women. The recommendations presented at the end of the report reinforce the myths and stereotypes about Indigenous people using deterministic and fatalistic and deficit-focused language of mental illness, and that suicide is solely an issue to be addressed through increased surveillance. So much of the recommendations were around increasing cameras or increasing documentation, and increased access to psychiatry. Indigeneity gets defined as risk and ignores the social realities of the Indigenous youth, and instead distills their suicide as their own inability to transcend their illness or circumstances, rather than potentially this is a rational response to incarceration from being forcibly removed from home community, and put into the Manitoba Youth Center, which is in a major urban city center. So that was really the summary of that initial paper. Like I said, I wrote that paper because it was something that had really frustrated me, having witnessed in my work. And then, like I said, you never know where these publications might get you. But after I finished the PhD, Dr. Rita Henderson, who is faculty at Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary, reached out to me, and she said she had been using that paper for several years in her own work, and invited me to do a postdoc with her. So I went back into my that area of research for my postdoc, and it was kind of a neat coincidence because I had moved to Calgary to work with Dr. Henderson, and my colleague, Dr. Travis Hay, who I did the PhD with, also ended up in Calgary with me at the same time. Dr. Hay is a historian and has written a couple books on settler colonialism over the last couple of years. And so when we both arrived in Calgary, we decided to continue the inquest research as a way to better acquaint ourselves with our new home and better understanding what was happening in Alberta. And we decided to expand the scope to identify the larger themes across inquests, as opposed to like the single case study that I had done in the first paper. So this is still a work in progress, but I think we have some neat findings so far, so I'm happy to share them with all of you today. Yeah, so And then also we can thank Dr. Anslos for advancing the area of Indigenous suicide research from a critical perspective. Has been significant developments in the field since I first wrote 10 years ago, and really can offer a really strong framework for suicide justice and the incorporation of Indigenous studies, knowledges, to unsettle settler colonial suicidology and prevention efforts. And so Dr. Anslos argues for justice and suicide research that involves co-creating meaning and relationality that resist narrow definitions of justice and health that are often deficit focused. So both Dr. Hay and myself are not Indigenous. We're both white. And so what our contribution we hope can be is a critical analysis of studying the colonial power structures and discourses to better demonstrate the power relationships at play and ultimately to support the advancement of Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous justice to ideally address the crisis of suicide. And the findings from this work, not the suicide stuff, but some of the other findings from the inquest work have been relied upon, specifically around overdose deaths in recent years. And so we're happy to continue going through all these inquests and extracting what data we can in these efforts. And that's our hopeful contribution to this growing body of literature. Briefly chat with you about our research methods. I'm going to talk a bit more in a moment about the archival research that Dr. Hay did. My research contribution to the project was looking through all of the inquests that are available online, which is 1991 to present day. So just about a 30-year period. And I was supported by research assistant Caitlin Feely, who's now doing her master's at the University of Victoria, who very diligently went through every single inquest published on the Alberta website. And we looked through them very carefully to identify Indigenous deaths, to identify common themes, as well as how the discourses may have shifted or changed over the 30-year period, or what has remained consistent. Dr. Hay reviewed the historical inquests at the archives in Edmonton, and similarly with the intention of identifying deaths of Indigenous peoples to put the contemporary or more recent inquests into this larger historical context. And then, yeah, the critical discourse analysis of the texts and the accompanying documents. And when I say accompanying documents, in some of the larger inquests, the other institutions involved will be invited to write responses to the recommendations. And so those are captured in the kind of inquest documents that we're continuing to analyze. So one of the major challenges of doing this work is actually, well, it's the topic of what I did my postdoc on, was identification of Indigenous peoples in administrative healthcare data. So we have a lot of the similar issues here, is that inquests have a very narrow framework of what they need to report on, and they've historically very rarely included any socio-demographic information. That's actually been a more recent development that started around year 2000. Again, it's not required, but we are seeing a little bit more of that social identity data being captured. But aside from age and place of death, there's really very little to go on unless the judge incorporates it. Which again is a major limitation of the research, which I'm going to talk a bit about how we identified folks and the limitation. So obviously this method is quite flawed because it's often hard to identify those that may not have explicit ties to their home community. So if they didn't have residence in First Nation or didn't have the place of death in a First Nation, it's really hard to situate somebody. It definitely excludes a lot of urban Indigenous peoples or Métis peoples not living in Métis settlement, for example. So how we identified Indigenous peoples in the inquests was cross-referencing obituary. Again, another limitation is if there's no obituary published or it's not available online. The place of residence. So if it was a First Nation, we made the assumption that they were First Nations. Of course, that could be flawed, but that's what we did. As well as identify it. Some of the judges do explicitly identify the individual as Indigenous. Not, like I said, it doesn't always happen, but some do, as well as identifying like witness testimony. So, for example, if they have extensive testimony from a chief or an Indigenous advocacy organization, we make the assumption that there is some linkage to an Indigenous identity. But like I said, it's a flawed method, but I'm happy to take feedback on how we could improve that too. And then I just thought this was interesting. This is some of what Travis found at the archives. This is one of the inquests that he retrieved. And so what he found was actually there was sizable inquest information available between 1898 to 1913. Many of the historical inquests were actually handwritten documents until about 1908, when they introduced a standardized form, which is what you can see here. What I found really interesting about his research is that in this historical period, almost exclusively the deaths focused on poisoned alcohol. But what's, I don't want to say fascinating, but also frightening, is that the public disturbance wasn't so much that Indigenous people were dying from ingestion of poisoned alcohol, but rather settlers were bringing in alcohol and giving it to Indigenous peoples. So that was really the concern of the inquiry, was punishing these settlers for giving Indigenous peoples alcohol, as opposed to people were actually dying from this alcohol. You can see here on the name, so they would have the name and then in brackets Indian, which was how we identified folks in the inquests here. And of course, like I said before, there are some flaws to the methodology because they might not always have that on the certificate, but we did find quite a few with tagged as this way. So, and then around 1913, these just stop appearing in the archives. And so we're not too sure what happened in that historical period, whether it moved offices or another governmental body became responsible. As I said, this is still a work in progress, but yeah, we have the data up to 1913 and then starting again in 1991. And so we have a bit of a gap there, and we're not entirely sure where to keep looking for those. And I'm not the historian, so I can't answer any questions on that part, but I thought it was quite interesting. So getting back into the more specific findings around the suicide inquests for adults, all of the suicides, I said most, but I'm going to be bold and say all had occurred within the criminal legal system, either in police custody or in a custodial institution. For young people, for anyone under 18, it was almost exclusively child welfare related. Of course, another big limitation of doing this research is what I found was they're only being labeled as suicide when it's a death by hanging. Other causes of death could have very well been suicide, but they're not classified as such. So, for example, overdose death, death by police shooting, or deemed accidental. It's really hard to discern kind of what, but I'll show you in the next slide. So this is the suicides that I was able to identify. This is focusing exclusively on the child welfare, because otherwise it was just going to be too much for one presentation. But from 1991 to present day, I was able to identify 15 suicides of Indigenous youth. As you can see here, a majority of whom are First Nations, with one in Calgary and one in Edmonton. All of them were by hanging, and ranging in age from the youngest being 13 to the oldest being 17. And two of the early inquests, they did not provide ages. And again, the fact that this is all First Nations youth could speak to just the limitations of the methodology and challenges around identification. It's hard to say for sure. Another thing I just want to draw your attention to is if you look at the early inquests at the bottom here, They were happening quite rapidly after the death, so within a year. Come up to 2015, 8 years later. So that's a trend that we're not just noticing in inquests, but in litigation more generally. But it is concerning just the amount of time that it's taking, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that in the conclusion of what are the consequences of that. So, um, because there was quite a bit of data to draw from here, what I thought would be most interesting was to compare the earliest inquest, so the one that happened in 2000 to the one in 2015, to see like what kinds of changes or what can we extract from like how these inquests are being run, and how are these suicides being discussed within the inquest. And I mean, I don't think anyone here is going to be terribly surprised by what I found, is that the recommendations tend to just keep repeating themselves over and over and over again about the reliance to increase surveillance of youth. We need better records. We need to increase contact with the criminal legal system and have more RCMP officers available, to increase contact between the child welfare system, social worker checking in more frequently, and physical changes. So a lot of focus. I read a lot of recommendations around weight-bearing closets rods, as a central focus of we need more policy to improve the infrastructure of the closets. Um, so to put in breakaway bars. So of course, there's always a few references to the lack of resources available to the youth and the need to increase mental health and substance use support within communities. And some of the inquests have actually done a pretty good job of putting the First Nation community in a historical context. But what's interesting is many of them don't actually use the language of colonialism, or they use really passive language. So, for example, in one inquest, the judge provides an in-depth history of the nation, but uses passive language referencing the disappearance of buffalo, or that the First Nation had only relatively recently entered into modernity with the introduction of electricity in the 1950s, obscuring any type of responsibility of the state. A lot of the inquests rely on deficit-based language. So there was one inquest into the death of KC in 2005, and the judge states, and this is a direct quote from the report, some families remain disconnected from Tsuut'ina development, beset as they were with broken families, substance abuse, unreconciled conflict, and poverty. Or the most recent inquest that's been published, the judge actually reviewed all 11 prior inquests into the suicides of Indigenous youth. And the judge actually really eloquently expresses their own frustration through the witness testimony about the government at all levels, continuing to do these inquests, presenting these recommendations, and then really doing nothing. The judge actually goes so far as citing the financial cost of the inquest, given the sheer number of counsel that were hired to represent all these organizations and all these high-level execs that come in to testify as witness, and suggests perhaps these funds could be better used to implement some of the recommendations and calls on all levels of government to use these findings to better support First Nations through funding. Yet, like I said earlier, the judge never once uses the word colonialism, instead providing an ahistorical analysis relying heavily on non-Indigenous governments saving First Nations and coming in with their side discourses. So as I mentioned, I'm still working through what the conclusion is because I don't know what I can offer that hasn't already been said, in terms of what is the utility of the inquiry. I mean, realistically, it does provide families and communities with additional insights into the circumstances in which their loved one has died. There can be public attention through media. Many of these inquests receive quite significant media coverage at times. There can be consequences that may occur for individuals, not through the actual proceedings itself, but for example, they might lose their job for the role that they may have played. It could be used for advocacy purposes, but there's really little evidence to support that the number of inquests and inquiries into Indigenous deaths across these institutions have really resulted in any material change. As mentioned, from the child welfare sample of the earliest to the most recent, it's the same recommendations over and over again. And then when you take into consideration the significant time delays that have been happening, many of the organizations involved respond with, "We've already implemented these changes," or "This was 8 years ago, things are different now." So there's even less and less accountability to be had through policy change with the more and more delays that are occurring within the legal system, even more generally speaking. And of course, I think the main takeaway here is the need to advance and support First Nations and Indigenous sovereignty more broadly, and relying on Indigenous justice mechanisms as opposed to the colonial inquest, which I'm very wary of when folks, I know I want to support folks that are advancing calls for inquests and inquiries, but I also feel very hesitant in terms of their actual utility and what they can do and what they can't do. But that concludes my presentation for this afternoon, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Wow. Thank you so much, Mandy. This has been really rich, insightful, both historical and contemporary research that you've been a part of. I think one of the things that I kind of wanted to maybe to get us kick-started here, you initially, I was formulating a question that you kind of just spoken to, which is that like, your research makes pretty clear, as has, a number of others folks, certainly Shireen's work, that there is like a clear constraint, or we could even go further to say like that the inquest is serving the aims of the colonial structure. It fails to deliver justice. Yet, not just communities, but Indigenous political leaders are often at the front lines of media, um, calling for these sort of socio-legal mechanisms, and calling for inquests into deaths in custody, and particularly by suicide. And I think you made a really interesting point too about the increasing connecting and parallels between deaths, premature deaths through drug poisoning or overdosing, or uh, an array of related substance issues, and suicide. But these are mechanisms that have clearly been demonstrated to do very little, and actually often reinforce the power structures that Indigenous people are working actively to resist. And yet it's something our own leaders and community members and families, survivors, are often calling for. Um, and so I guess so I guess, okay, I want to ask kind of a question that is about, do you think there's any defensible reason, um, politically, to continue to support those calling for the use of these mechanisms? Maybe beyond simply like solidarity and alignment. Do you think there's any strategic political reasons for us, in terms of theories of change, or are they really a waste of our resources, both economic and social? I'm just really curious what you think.
I'm curious what you think, but I feel
I'll
that
tell you after.
I one of the books that's really good. It's called Reconciling Truths, by Kim Stanton, who's a lawyer. She really focuses on specifically the history of the inquest from even pre-Confederation as a tool of colonialism. But with that being said, she does offer some complexity of that in terms of the utility. And I think it's like my response of anyone who wants to use the legal system, whether it's reporting violent crime or initiating civil legal action. It's like, what are you hoping to get out of this? Because if it's justice, it's not happening. But there's other things that you can get through engaging in these processes. It might not be legal justice, but it might be the opportunity, for example, to create documents, a historical record, right, of really critical inquests and inquiries that, like, I'm sure you cite and reference frequently, whether it's the MMIWG inquiry or the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People or the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry of Manitoba. These are really seminal documents and really critical for advancing policy recommendations. What to what end? I mean, is a question mark. But yeah, I'm not, I don't think I'm advocating to abandon it either at the same time. I think it's just more nuanced of what do you hope to achieve through engaging in this inquest. And many of the families in the more recent inquests, just because of the delay, they're like, no, we're good. We're not participating in this. Like we need to move on with our lives. And I think that that makes sense. But yeah, it there are pieces in terms of advocacy and engaging with colonial governments. It's how, I don't know, the only other parallel I can think is like collection of quantitative data and the power in that for speaking the same language of colonial governments, really.
Mhm.
What do you think?
I mean, I totally I agree with the idea that in a way we need to more on the end of like what do we do about it going forward is I think we need public and maybe more precisely like movement education around a more complicated story about what sociolegal mechanisms offer. I do think they hold some potential for more proximal and temporary like material redress. And I think that can come in a variety of forms. It can come in like public engagement in the issue that is otherwise invisibilized, or it can come sometimes in civil proceedings through settlements. But I don't think that's justice, and it's certainly, yeah, it's certainly constrained. But sometimes maybe necessary, sometimes maybe not. I think we like to convince ourselves that it's especially when it's surrounding issues that are so deeply like painful that they're doing something. But I think a very important question you're asking and that we need to be asking is, is it draining us more than actually sustaining the life that we're struggling for today in our communities? And I also think there's something too, you talked about the language of tragedy a little bit and like how tragedy is actually not the right word for what we're describing when we're talking about like structures of violence that are producing the very ends that they're intended to produce. Um, I'll just make a couple quick comments and then I'll pass it off to others who may have questions. But I'm fascinated by the idea of like race-based data collection also being very derived by the government of the day. And I think it's really interesting. I'd be curious to look at like the period of time between inquests and the shifting of Alberta's government to see if there's any interesting like fluctuations that happen in particular in the post Nolte uh, NDP switch back to kind of a reactionary right-wing government. Um, I mean, there's so many like buckling down on carceral measures that take place at that point across a number of issues, but I do think it was interesting the period of time that the inquests get longer and more protracted does appear to be the point I think at which Kenney came to power. Um,
And I think it's also interesting, or my initial analysis of why the 90s had no recognition was like this, like, I don't see color kind of narrative. Like that, it doesn't matter. We're all equal and all the same, because really there's nothing about really any demographic data or like gender identity, like a race-based identity, like it was like everyone is the same. And then yeah, as we got to year 2000, it became a little bit more in depth. But yeah, the political
Yeah.
influence today.
When Ford came to power in Ontario, there was a sudden relitigating of desegregated race-based information, particularly in the coronal system. And so, yeah, I think some grad student who's interested in a really fun study should do a historical study on coronal data monitoring practices over the last 20 years in Canada by jurisdiction and look at what the shifts in government bring about in terms of collection. There's almost a third of the country that doesn't collect race-based information presently related to coronal data. And yeah, I mean, it's really clear that some governments don't want us counting anything because they're very clearly aware of the race-based nature of the social and health inequities. But it's also true that counting numbers doesn't change anything either. It's fundamentally, we have to really think about the material that I'm so appreciative of your invitation towards that kind of thinking. Um, are there other folks who have questions? I really would encourage you to ask. And maybe extend it first to uh, Deanna and the Critical Health and Social Action Lab folks if they're here who want to ask.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks, Mandy. I really appreciated this. I used to live a couple kilometers from the Manitoba Youth Center, um, and was studying nearby restorative justice after spending time in youth centers in Los Angeles. So it's a place that I used to drive by and just get the worst feelings about, having never stepped foot in them, probably from my own lived experience of other places like it. And so I think I've just been ruminating on um, not just not necessarily funding inquiries, but like what we are funding that we could direct otherwise. So like kind of the question of abolition and really thinking about what defunding the carceral system would look like. And I know that's not necessarily where your work takes us, but I'm just curious if you have thoughts about um, not just not funding inquiries, but where else funds could be directed.
Yeah, well, like I said, having done 5 years of working with women and girls in custody, I think the abolitionist undercurrent of a lot of the work is what drives a lot of it. And
Yeah,
um, absolutely, especially when you are somewhere like Manitoba and it is just so, I mean, it's not to say it's not blatantly racist here, but it is so visibly racist when you step
yeah,
inside a women's jail, federal or provincial, just given the significant overrepresentation of Indigenous women, like one of the fastest growing prison populations, and directly tied to, did the injustices that these women and girls face structurally. So absolutely. And then to tell them that they're just not able to cope with the conditions of imprisonment, that was so regularly what I would see. I would see women put, and my big passion was around advocacy for women who were put in segregation
mhm,
because they were deemed at risk. And who's deemed most at risk? It was primarily First Nations women. And it just was so counterintuitive to what we know
yeah,
about trauma and mental health and well-being. So yeah, absolutely. I think that there's definitely an abolitionist perspective that is very embedded in a lot of the work I do, but to some extent still do engage in systems level advocacy, engaging in the legal system strategically when necessary.
yeah. No, thank you. I think I really appreciated how you brought out the reluctance to discuss colonialism um, as precisely a means that prevents us from moving into abolishing the structures of it. So yeah, thanks for your work on that.
Well, thank you so much. Mhm. Are you talking, Jeffrey?
Oh, I am. Shit. That's me. I was just going to say that Senator Kim Pate, who's the Senator for Ontario's report on injustices and miscarriages of justice experienced by 12 Indigenous women, made a really interesting observation that the TRC, which for those of you coming in today from outside of Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which published its report in 2015, has, supposedly as a mechanism of change, garnered substantive engagement by the legal system and public education around the racialized nature of criminalization and incarceration. But since 2015, the rates of incarceration for Indigenous women have increased exponentially every year. And I think that that's actually quite like damning that, whether we're talking about an inquiry into death in custody at the level of a single case, or whether we're talking about a national transitional justice like commission, um, it's really clear that these mechanisms are not only, and educators are the most guilty of this, saying all the time that public education is the theory of change. If we're more aware of racialized inequities, it does something. But that report was just so damning to me in the ways in which we can't delude ourselves into thinking that public awareness about these issues are itself going to be a mechanism of substantive material change. And back to everyone on the line. I see there is a comment that came in. Oh, and that was George letting me know I was muted, but thank you, George. Are there any other questions? I see Nicole at the center of my screen, not to put you on the spot, but do you have anything you'd like to ask?
Thanks so much for this presentation, Dr. Gray. I'm actually very familiar with a lot of your work in advocacy. I'm a graduate of the Assaulted Women and Children's Counseling Advocacy Program in Toronto. And so thank you for your advocacy. I think I have so many thoughts and wonderings. I really valued all the care that you put into stringing together this data. I have a colleague who's very interested in child suicide, and I'm not sure if she's on the line, but I'm watching your presentation and I'm wondering if you see reports of anyone under the age of 12 who's you're finding data on who's been listed as a suicide.
In this specific data set, so it wasn't all the suicides, and I mean there are some limitations here because we only pulled out the ones that we were able to identify as Indigenous, and the youngest being 13. But yeah, it would just be a matter of going back and looking through the see if there's younger, but I don't recall specific deaths being labeled as suicide for anyone younger than that. I mean, the other challenge, like I said, limitation being they're really only being classified as suicide if it's a death by hanging. So I don't know if that could also complicate things with the age and the manner in which the individual died. But yeah, I haven't, nothing really comes to mind younger than 13. It really seems to be the 13 to 17 kind of age group. And then if you move into the adults, it's really younger adults as well. I think the oldest was like 35. Majority of them were mid-20s, and those were all in carceral facilities. So that's a great question, but unfortunately, nothing really comes to mind from this set of research that we did in Alberta.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks so much for all your kind words. I really appreciate it.
I'll
Means
let someone else
means
know.
reduction is an interesting piece, though, that this, especially in the child welfare system, is like literally the policy recommendations are always, I've literally sat in meetings where I've been told that reserve housing needs to not have closet bars. And yeah, it's such a it's such an insult to communities like that we basically like think about means reduction as the answer, and yet the like yeah, there's a failure to really enact any kind of autopsy beyond the psychological, and consider the ways in which even some of these approaches to means reduction make housing conditions even more unlivable. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such I know more about closet rods than I ever thought I would know, just reading through these inquests. And it's just such a fixation on the actual physical infrastructure of drawers instead of closets. And yeah, it's just it takes up so much space in every inquest.
Yeah, the thing that I hear increasingly too are like, so it's the surveillance of like living spaces. So like foster care homes with like an increased securitization of the bedroom, or all these sorts of incursions into daily life that are really reiterating the logics of policing and surveillance, yet failing to actually surveil these structural conditions that are producing a racialized child welfare system or a racialized prison system. um yeah, it's interesting, fascinating, terrifying, and also I'm often left with this, what's the like, so what do we do here? And I guess I want to maybe wrap up with a question around like, if you were to sort of speak to movements organizing around um these particular deaths, what do you see from your perspective, both working in gender-based violence, and this intersection of Indigenous health? Um, what do you see perhaps as the most immediate pressure point around organizing that makes life better for communities now? Uh,
Oh. That's a tough question in this current political climate,
yeah.
especially in Alberta, where they've really dissolved all of the like there was a Indigenous Wisdom Council, for example, and that's done. So even getting like guidance from Wisdom Council, like that's really difficult in the well, Alberta, Ontario is not much better. But what the pressure points are, I think right now it's going to be politically challenging time for a lot of communities, a lot of First Nations, a lot of organizations. Um, I'm still at a loss and I wish I had a more robust answer, but I feel very sad about the current political state. Because as I was doing this research was when Danielle Smith was elected into power, and I was working in AHS and the Indigenous Wellness Corps and started to see all these big shifts start happening, and funding being cut pretty significantly. And I think the consequences are going to be so dire. I guess how do we get people to care more? Question mark. I'm sorry, I don't have a great answer. Does anyone else have a good answer?
It is a really tough question, but
It
actually
was a really tough question. I'm still trying to figure that out for myself right now.
yeah. But I do think actually your comment right at the end there is part of it, it is like, and it goes back to Christian's book as well, this like getting people to care, getting people to humanize, dignify the life that people are navigating is, I think, a foundational part of the struggle, and it's also the very basis by which any form of mutual aid will ever occur, is through energizing our ability to care for one another in the midst of like some of the most grotesque forms of social and political abandonment and violence. And that's not an easy struggle ahead of us. I think is actually a really important thing to speak truthfully, is that we're in a time, and I think for many communities, approaching a time where that struggle is intensifying. But I do actually think there's a lot of wisdom in your call towards a radical form of care, um, even in your in-process answer, and that's just real. I
Yes.
appreciate it.
Still a work in progress, given all the developments that are constantly coming and the cutting of research funds and like, yeah, I think it's going to be a challenging time, but that's not a reason to stop or like give up.
It's yeah, it makes actually clear the stakes of what we have to struggle for. And yeah, I just want to say thank you. We'll formally end our salon here today, and just want to express my sincere gratitude, Mandy, for being with us today and sharing such a powerful talk. I know that we're going to have lunch soon and coffee.
Yeah.
soon, and I will say there's a lot more that we could be talking about in terms of collaborations here, and I think there's some interesting points of convergence actually in some of the projects that are underway in our lab. So looking forward to that, but sincere gratitude for sharing today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.